The fastest way to discover someone's character is to watch what they do when they think nobody important is watching. The granite steps of the Jefferson County Courthouse were already crowded when Danielle Brooks arrived that morning. Lawyers carrying briefcases moved through the entrance. Reporters gathered near the front plaza waiting for updates on several high-profile hearings. Court employees hurried between government vehicles and security checkpoints. It was the kind of busy morning that made everyone focus on their own schedule. Almost everyone. Danielle stepped from a rideshare vehicle wearing a charcoal gray business suit and carrying a leather case filled with documents. Her expression was calm and focused. She walked toward the courthouse entrance with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going and exactly why she was there. She had almost reached the bottom of the courthouse steps when a voice stopped her. "Hold it right there." Danielle turned. A uniformed police officer was walking directly toward her. His name was Officer Ryan Whitaker. His expression carried the certainty of a man who believed he had already figured everything out. Several people nearby slowed their pace. Others continued walking but glanced over their shoulders. Public confrontations always attracted attention. Ryan stopped a few feet in front of Danielle and looked her up and down. "Where do you think you are going?" he asked. Danielle looked toward the courthouse entrance and then back at him. "Inside." A few people nearby exchanged curious looks. Ryan folded his arms. "Inside for what?" "Work," Danielle answered calmly. The response seemed to annoy him. "Work?" he repeated. "I do not think so." The comment immediately attracted more attention. A reporter standing near the courthouse fountain lowered her phone and began watching. Two attorneys stopped halfway up the stairs. Danielle remained completely composed. "Is there a problem, officer?" Ryan glanced toward the courthouse entrance and then back at her. "The problem is that people show up here every day pretending they belong somewhere they do not." The statement hung in the air. Danielle did not react. She simply adjusted the leather case in her hand. Imagine standing in front of dozens of strangers while someone publicly questions your right to be there. Most people would become defensive. Most people would argue. Danielle did neither. Her calmness only seemed to increase Ryan's confidence. "Identification," he said. Danielle studied him for a moment before reaching into her purse. But before she could retrieve anything, Ryan continued speaking. "Actually, before we do that, tell me why you are really here." The crowd had grown noticeably larger. Courthouse employees lingered near the entrance. Several reporters quietly moved closer. Danielle noticed all of it. Her expression never changed. "I already told you," she said. "I am here for work." Ryan shook his head. "That answer is not good enough." Danielle glanced briefly toward the courthouse doors. The look lasted less than a second. Yet there was something unusual about it. It was not nervousness. It was not frustration. It almost looked like she was waiting for something. Or someone. Ryan interpreted her silence as guilt. Danielle treated it as patience. Neither man nor woman in the growing crowd understood what was about to happen next. But before the morning was over, everyone standing outside that courthouse would learn that assumptions can become very expensive mistakes. Officer Ryan Whitaker seemed almost encouraged by Danielle Brooks's silence. In his mind, calmness was not confidence. It was hesitation. The growing crowd only strengthened that belief. Reporters remained near the courthouse fountain. Attorneys lingered on the steps. Court employees slowed their pace as they entered the building. What had started as a brief encounter was becoming a public spectacle. Ryan took a step closer. "You keep saying you are here for work," he said. "What kind of work?" Danielle met his eyes. "Legal work." Ryan smiled slightly. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who believed he had just caught an inconsistency. "Legal work," he repeated. "That is a pretty broad answer." Danielle remained composed. "You asked a broad question." Several people nearby exchanged amused looks. Ryan noticed them immediately. His expression hardened. He did not like feeling challenged, especially in front of an audience. "Let me make this easier," he said. "Who exactly are you meeting inside?" Danielle adjusted the leather case in her hand. "People expecting me." The answer was technically true, but it clearly was not the answer Ryan wanted. Around them, the crowd continued to grow. A young courthouse clerk standing near the entrance suddenly looked directly at Danielle. The recognition on his face appeared instantly. His eyes widened slightly. Then he quickly reached for his phone. The movement was subtle. Most people missed it. Danielle did not. Neither did a reporter named Lisa Grant, who had spent years covering courthouse stories. She followed the clerk's gaze toward Danielle and frowned thoughtfully. There was something familiar about the woman standing at the center of the confrontation. Lisa simply could not place it yet. Ryan continued. You know, people who belong here usually answer questions directly. Danielle nodded politely. And people who ask questions usually listen to the answers. A few members of the crowd quietly murmured. Ryan folded his arms. Imagine standing in front of dozens of strangers while someone repeatedly assumes the worst about you. Most people would eventually become frustrated. Most people would try to defend themselves. Danielle seemed completely uninterested in doing either. Instead, she briefly looked toward the courthouse entrance again. The glance lasted only a second, but it was enough. The clerk who had made the phone call lowered his device and immediately appeared relieved. Moments later, another courthouse employee emerged from the building. He looked toward Danielle, stopped walking, and quickly disappeared back inside. Lisa noticed that too. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. People inside the courthouse seemed to know exactly who Danielle was. Ryan remained unaware. His attention stayed fixed on proving himself right. You still have not given me a good reason to believe you belong here, he said. Danielle looked at him calmly. That is because I do not need to convince you. The answer landed like a stone in still water. Silence spread through the crowd. Ryan stared at her. Danielle's voice had remained polite, but for the first time, there was an unmistakable certainty behind it. Somewhere inside the courthouse, a set of doors opened. Several people emerged and began moving quickly toward the front steps. Danielle noticed them immediately. Then, for the first time that morning, a faint smile appeared on her face. The faint smile on Danielle Brooks's face immediately changed the atmosphere outside the courthouse. It was not a smile of victory. It was not a smile of satisfaction. It was the expression of someone who had just seen an expected event arrive precisely on schedule. Officer Ryan Whitaker noticed it at once. Something funny, he asked. Danielle shook her head. Not at all. Behind them, several individuals emerged from the courthouse entrance and moved briskly across the plaza. They were not rushing, but they were clearly headed somewhere specific. One was an older attorney carrying a thick binder. Another appeared to be a senior court administrator. A third wore a dark suit and carried a folder stamped with official court markings. The moment they stepped outside, their eyes moved directly toward Danielle. Lisa Grant noticed the reaction immediately. So did several attorneys standing nearby. The recognition was unmistakable. Ryan remained focused on Danielle. You still have not answered my questions. Danielle looked at him calmly. I answered every question you asked. The response only increased his frustration. Around them, more people had stopped to watch. The courthouse steps were now lined with observers pretending not to stare while doing exactly that. Imagine standing in the center of a public square while dozens of strangers silently wait to see who will be proven right. The pressure alone would overwhelm most people. Yet Danielle appeared more relaxed with every passing minute. The approaching group continued across the plaza. As they drew closer, the older attorney suddenly slowed. His expression shifted from curiosity to surprise. Then recognition. Danielle, he called out. The entire crowd seemed to freeze. Danielle turned toward him and offered a polite nod. Good morning, Richard. Several attorneys on the courthouse steps immediately looked at one another. The name carried weight. Lisa saw the reaction ripple through the legal professionals nearby. Whatever they recognized, it mattered. Ryan frowned. You know her? Richard looked genuinely confused by the question. Of course I know her. Before he could say more, the court administrator beside him stepped forward. Ms. Brooks, everyone has been looking for you. Another ripple moved through the crowd. Danielle remained composed. I was delayed, she said. The administrator glanced briefly toward Ryan before returning her attention to Danielle. The hearing preparations are complete. Hearing preparations. The words landed heavily. Ryan suddenly felt as though he had entered a conversation already in progress. Lisa quickly opened her notebook and began writing. Something important was unfolding. The attorneys standing nearby no longer looked curious. They looked concerned. One younger lawyer whispered something to a colleague while staring directly at Danielle. Another quietly stepped aside and made a phone call. Ryan noticed the reactions for the first time. Doubt crept into his expression. Small at first, barely visible, but it was there. Danielle adjusted her leather case and glanced toward the courthouse entrance. The people now gathering around her did not behave as though she were a stranger. They behaved as though she was expected, as though her arrival mattered. And as the crowd continued growing outside the courthouse, one question began spreading silently from person to person. Who exactly was Danielle Brooks, and why did everyone inside the building suddenly seem to know her name? The question spread through the crowd faster than any official announcement could have. Who exactly was Danielle Brooks? The answer remained just out of reach, and that uncertainty seemed to affect everyone except Danielle herself. She stood calmly beside the courthouse steps while attorneys, court employees, and reporters watched the scene unfold. Officer Ryan Whitaker, however, refused to step back. If anything, the growing attention only reinforced his determination. He had already committed to his conclusion, and walking away now would feel like admitting he had been wrong. "I am still waiting for identification," he said. Danielle looked at him politely. "You have been waiting for many things this morning." The response drew a few quiet reactions from nearby observers. Ryan ignored them. The older attorney, named Richard, shifted uncomfortably. It was becoming increasingly obvious that he wanted the situation to end. "Officer," he said carefully, "there is probably a misunderstanding here." Ryan immediately turned toward him. "Then perhaps someone should explain it." Richard glanced at Danielle. Danielle simply remained silent. That silence fascinated Lisa Grant more than anything else. Most people placed in Danielle's position would have rushed to reveal their credentials. They would have demanded respect. Danielle seemed willing to let events unfold naturally. Imagine standing in front of a crowd that is slowly realizing who you are while you remain completely unconcerned with proving it. That level of confidence could not be faked. Nearby, another group emerged from the courthouse entrance. This time, several individuals wore dark suits and carried case files. The moment they stepped outside, they noticed Danielle. Their reaction was immediate. One stopped walking entirely. Another whispered something to a colleague. A third checked his watch and visibly relaxed. Ryan followed their gaze and frowned. He was beginning to notice a pattern he could no longer ignore. Everyone coming out of the courthouse seemed to recognize Danielle. Nobody seemed surprised she was there. The only person who appeared surprised was him. The court administrator stepped closer. "Ms. Brooks, the judge has already arrived." The statement landed heavily. Several reporters looked up at once. Judges did not adjust schedules for ordinary visitors. Danielle nodded. "Thank you." Ryan stared at her. "The judge?" Danielle looked toward the courthouse entrance. "That is usually how court works." Even Richard could not hide a faint smile. Ryan's jaw tightened. Around him, the crowd had shifted. Earlier, people watched because they suspected Danielle might not belong. Now they watched because they suspected she belonged far more than anyone initially realized. Lisa continued taking notes. The story was changing shape in real time. What had started as a public challenge was becoming something else entirely. A lesson, a revelation, perhaps both. Then another voice called out from the courthouse steps. "Danielle." A distinguished woman in judicial robes had appeared near the entrance. The moment she spoke, the crowd fell silent. The judge smiled warmly and began walking toward Danielle. And for the first time that morning, genuine uncertainty appeared in Officer Ryan Whitaker's eyes. The appearance of the judge transformed the atmosphere outside the courthouse more than any argument ever could. Conversations stopped. Reporters lowered their voices. Attorneys standing on the courthouse steps straightened their posture almost instinctively. The distinguished woman in judicial robes walked directly toward Danielle Brooks with a warm smile that suggested familiarity rather than formality. Officer Ryan Whitaker watched the scene unfold in complete silence. Every instinct that had guided him earlier that morning was now colliding with a reality he could not yet explain. "Danielle," the judge said as she approached. "We were beginning to think traffic had won." A few people in the crowd laughed softly. Danielle smiled politely. "Not traffic," she replied. "Just an unexpected delay." The judge glanced briefly toward Ryan. The look lasted only a second, but its meaning was impossible to ignore. She clearly understood exactly what the delay had been. Around them, more courthouse personnel emerged from the building. Several attorneys exchanged greetings with Danielle. A court administrator handed her a folder. Another individual quietly confirmed that preparations inside were complete. Every interaction revealed the same thing. Danielle was not merely known inside the courthouse. She was respected. Imagine standing in a crowd while one assumption after another quietly falls apart. That was exactly what Ryan was experiencing. Earlier that morning, he believed he was questioning someone who did not belong. Now he was surrounded by evidence suggesting the opposite. Lisa Grant continued filling pages of notes. The story had evolved far beyond anything she expected when she first noticed the confrontation. She watched as another senior attorney approached Danielle and shook her hand. The man's expression reflected genuine admiration. "Good to see you again," he said. "Everyone has been talking about today's hearing." Hearing. The word immediately caught the attention of nearby reporters. Ryan heard it too. "What hearing?" he asked before he could stop himself. Nobody answered immediately. Danielle remained calm. The judge looked toward him. A significant one. The response was polite, yet it somehow made the situation feel even larger. Ryan glanced around the plaza. People were no longer watching Danielle with suspicion. They were watching her with curiosity and respect. The shift was impossible to miss. A younger attorney standing near the courthouse entrance suddenly whispered something to a colleague. Both immediately looked toward Danielle. Lisa noticed the exchange and moved closer. "What is it?" she quietly asked. The attorney hesitated. "You do not recognize her?" Lisa shook her head. The attorney looked genuinely surprised. "That is Danielle Brooks." The name alone seemed meaningful, but before Lisa could ask another question, the attorney added something that caused her eyes to widen. Nearby, several reporters reacted exactly the same way. Recognition spread through the crowd like a wave. Ryan saw it happening. He saw faces changing. He saw people exchanging looks. He saw realization replacing uncertainty. Yet he still did not understand why. Danielle accepted the folder from the court administrator and prepared to head inside. But as more people began recognizing her name, one thing became clear. The woman standing before him was not simply a lawyer. She was someone whose reputation had already entered the courthouse long before she arrived. Recognition moved through the crowd with surprising speed. One attorney whispered to another. A reporter looked up from her notes with widened eyes. Court employees exchanged knowing glances. The name Danielle Brooks had suddenly become the center of attention, and Officer Ryan Whitaker could feel the atmosphere changing around him. Yet he still did not fully understand why. He watched as more legal professionals approached Danielle with the kind of respect usually reserved for people who had earned it over many years. Danielle accepted each greeting politely. She did not appear impressed by the attention. If anything, she seemed slightly uncomfortable being the focus of it. That detail did not escape Lisa Grant. The reporter had covered enough public figures to recognize the difference between someone who demanded recognition and someone who had simply earned it. Danielle belonged firmly in the second category. "Can somebody tell me what is going on?" Ryan finally asked. The question sounded less confident than any of his previous statements. Nobody answered immediately. Several people looked toward Danielle. Others looked toward the judge. The silence itself seemed to carry meaning. Imagine standing in a room where everyone knows something important except you. That feeling was beginning to settle heavily on Ryan's shoulders. The judge smiled politely. "Officer, perhaps you should allow Ms. Brooks to get to work." Ryan frowned. What exactly is her job? The question lingered in the air. Nearby reporters immediately focused their attention on the conversation. Several attorneys exchanged glances. One senior lawyer finally stepped forward. "You really do not know who she is?" Ryan shook his head. The attorney looked genuinely surprised. "Danielle Brooks has argued some of the most important civil rights cases in this state during the last decade." A murmur moved through the crowd. Lisa immediately wrote the sentence down. Another attorney nodded. "She has appeared before state courts, federal courts, and appellate panels. Several landmark decisions cite her work directly," added another. Ryan stared at Danielle. The pieces were beginning to connect, but not quickly enough. He looked at the woman he had spent the morning questioning and suddenly realized that dozens of people around him viewed her very differently than he did. Danielle remained calm. She offered no correction, no speech, no attempt to amplify her reputation. The facts were speaking for themselves. The judge stepped closer. "Ms. Brooks is leading today's hearing team." The statement landed with unmistakable force. Reporters exchanged looks. Court employees nodded knowingly. Attorneys simply appeared unsurprised. They had expected this moment all along. Ryan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Leading the hearing meant Danielle was not merely attending court. She was one of the central figures in the proceedings everyone had gathered to watch. The realization changed everything. Yet as significant as the revelation seemed, Danielle's expression suggested there was still more to the story. She accepted another folder from a court administrator and glanced briefly toward the courthouse entrance. Around her, legal professionals continued preparing for the day. And as Ryan struggled to reconcile the woman before him with the assumptions he had made earlier that morning, a new question emerged. If Danielle Brooks was respected by judges, attorneys, and court officials across the state, what else had he failed to understand about the situation standing directly in front of him? The realization settled over the crowd slowly, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Danielle Brooks was not simply another attorney walking into a courthouse. She was someone whose work had shaped legal outcomes across the state. Reporters continued taking notes. Court employees exchanged knowing looks. Attorneys who had remained silent earlier now spoke openly about cases, hearings, and legal victories associated with her name. Yet the person at the center of all that attention appeared almost completely uninterested in discussing herself. Danielle simply reviewed the documents she had been handed and prepared for the hearing ahead. Officer Ryan Whitaker watched everything unfold with growing disbelief. The confident assumptions that had guided him earlier that morning now seemed increasingly fragile. Imagine discovering that the person you dismissed without knowing them has spent years earning the respect of judges, attorneys, and legal professionals across an entire region. That realization has a way of forcing uncomfortable reflection. A senior attorney stepped closer to Danielle and smiled. "The legal community has been talking about this case for months," he said. "Everyone knew you would be leading it." Several reporters immediately reacted. Lisa Grant looked up from her notebook. "Months. Leading it." Those words suggested something much larger than a routine hearing. Danielle acknowledged the comment with a polite nod. "The team deserves the credit," she said. The answer only reinforced the impression many people already had. Even now, with attention focused entirely on her, she redirected recognition toward others. Nearby, the judge listened with a faint smile. "That sounds exactly like Danielle," she said. The crowd responded with quiet laughter. Ryan remained silent. Every new piece of information seemed to widen the distance between his assumptions and reality. One of the attorneys standing nearby turned toward a reporter. "You know why this hearing matters, right?" The reporter shook her head. "Because the outcome could influence cases across multiple jurisdictions." The statement spread through the crowd immediately. This was no ordinary legal proceeding. Danielle was not simply appearing in court. She was helping lead one of the most significant legal matters currently moving through the system. Ryan felt the weight of that fact. Earlier, he had questioned whether she belonged there at all. Now he was learning that many people considered her one of the most important participants in the entire proceeding. Danielle finally closed the folder and prepared to enter the courthouse. But before she could move, another court official approached carrying additional documents. "These just arrived," he said. Danielle reviewed the materials briefly. The official lowered his voice and added something that only a few nearby people could hear. Yet the reaction from those who overheard it was immediate. Several attorneys exchanged surprised looks. The judge nodded thoughtfully. Lisa noticed everything. Whatever information had arrived seemed important. Very important. Danielle's expression remained calm, but even she appeared more focused than before. The hearing ahead was clearly larger than most people realized. As courthouse staff finalized preparations and legal teams gathered near the entrance, Ryan found himself asking a different question than the one he had asked all morning. No longer wondering whether Danielle belonged there. He was now wondering how many opportunities he had ignored to learn who she really was before making his judgment. The new documents seemed to alter the mood around the courthouse immediately. Attorneys who had been relaxed moments earlier now spoke in lower voices. Court staff moved with renewed urgency. Even the reporters sensed that something important had just entered the story. Danielle Brooks reviewed the pages carefully, her eyes moving across lines of text with practiced focus. When she finished, she closed the folder and handed several documents to members of her legal team. No dramatic reaction, no public announcement, just quiet professionalism. Yet somehow that restraint made the moment feel even more significant. Officer Ryan Whitaker watched from only a few feet away. Throughout the morning, he had searched for confirmation that his assumptions were correct. Instead, every new development seemed to reveal the opposite. Imagine spending hours building a conclusion only to discover that every fact points somewhere else. That was where Ryan now found himself. Lisa Grant noticed another unusual detail. Several senior attorneys had gathered near Danielle, but their conversation kept returning to one subject: documentation, records, evidence, procedures. Nobody discussed personal opinions. Nobody discussed emotions. Everything revolved around facts. That detail would later become important. A court administrator approached the judge and quietly handed her another folder. The judge reviewed it briefly before nodding. "Everything has been verified," she said. Nearby attorneys appeared relieved. Danielle acknowledged the statement with a simple nod. Then one of the senior lawyers turned toward the reporters gathered around the plaza. "Many of the findings presented today are based on months of documented review," he explained. "Every conclusion is supported by records." The crowd listened carefully. The statement sounded routine, yet it carried tremendous weight. Facts, records, documentation. Those words seemed to define the entire day. Ryan glanced toward Danielle. For the first time, he realized that her confidence had never come from status or reputation. It came from certainty. She already knew the facts. She had known them all morning. Another attorney stepped forward. Some of the material reviewed involved patterns of conduct, decision-making, and professional accountability. Several reporters immediately wrote down the statement. Lisa did the same. Around the plaza, people exchanged thoughtful looks. The hearing was clearly larger than a single legal dispute. It involved systems, procedures, and responsibilities extending far beyond one courtroom. Danielle remained composed. She had never once attempted to win an argument. She had simply waited for facts to arrive. Ryan felt the significance of that realization immediately. Earlier, he had relied on assumptions. Danielle had relied on evidence. The difference between those approaches now seemed impossible to ignore. Nearby, another court official quietly confirmed that all hearing materials had been finalized. Legal teams began moving toward the courthouse entrance. The crowd sensed that the public portion of the morning was nearing its end. Yet one final detail remained. As Danielle prepared to enter the building, a senior administrator paused beside the judge and spoke quietly enough that only a handful of people could hear. The judge nodded once before looking briefly toward Ryan. It was not an angry look. It was not even a critical one. It was the expression of someone who had just been reminded that actions leave records. And as courthouse doors opened and legal teams began filing inside, Ryan suddenly realized that the most important evidence discussed that morning was not hidden in a folder at all. Sometimes evidence is simply the way a person chooses to treat another when they believe nobody knows who they are. The courthouse doors remained open as legal teams, court officials, and attorneys gradually moved inside. The crowd that had gathered throughout the morning began to disperse, but nobody left without carrying a lesson from what they had witnessed. Danielle Brooks stood near the entrance reviewing one final document before handing it to a member of her team. Around her, judges, attorneys, and court personnel prepared for the hearing that would soon begin. Yet despite everything that had been revealed, Danielle behaved exactly as she had when she first arrived. Calm, professional, focused. She had never raised her voice. She had never demanded recognition. She had simply allowed the truth to arrive on its own schedule. Officer Ryan Whitaker remained near the bottom of the courthouse steps. The noise of the plaza seemed distant now. Earlier that morning, he had been certain of himself, certain of his judgment, certain of the conclusions he reached within moments of seeing a stranger. Now those certainties felt much smaller. Imagine realizing that the most important information about a person was never hidden from you. You simply never took the time to look for it. That realization stayed with Ryan as he watched Danielle prepare to enter the building. Nearby, Lisa Grant closed her notebook. The story she planned to write was no longer about a confrontation. It was about assumptions. It was about how quickly people decide who belongs and who does not. It was about the difference between perception and reality. A court administrator approached Danielle one final time. "Everything is ready," he said. Danielle nodded. "Good. Let us focus on the work." The simplicity of the response seemed to surprise several people nearby. After everything that had happened, she still cared more about the case than the attention surrounding it. The judge smiled as she overheard the exchange. "That is why people respect her," she said quietly to one of the attorneys standing beside her. Ryan heard the comment. For some reason, it stayed with him. Respect. Not authority. Not status. Respect. The distinction suddenly seemed important. Danielle adjusted the folder beneath her arm and began walking toward the courthouse entrance. Then she paused briefly and looked back across the plaza. Her eyes met Ryan's for a moment. There was no anger there, no triumph, no desire to embarrass him, only a quiet understanding. The kind that comes from knowing every person is capable of learning if they are willing to listen. Ryan lowered his gaze. The silence between them said more than another conversation ever could. Danielle then turned and continued toward the entrance. The courthouse doors opened wider as she approached. Attorneys followed behind her. Court officials stepped aside. Within moments, she disappeared into the building where the work waiting for her mattered far more than the misunderstanding she was leaving behind. The plaza slowly returned to normal. Reporters headed toward their vehicles. Employees resumed their schedules. Pedestrians continued down city sidewalks. Life moved forward. Yet one thought lingered long after the crowd was gone. Ryan believed a badge gave him the power to judge who belonged. Danielle understood that true authority comes from character, preparation, and truth. And on that courthouse plaza, the law did not need to argue. The facts spoke for themselves.